Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I feel like Cem Yılmaz or something. Sorry. It's my pleasure to be the chair of the first session for this afternoon. And I'm going to do my best. I've already spoken to the speakers. We're going to be very short, and we're going to finish on time. So we have lots of time, 15 minutes at the most, maybe just 10, depending, for your brilliant questions for the speakers at the end. I want to extend my thanks and congratulations to the organizing committee from the Students' Historical Society. I'll redouble what Professor Kalpakla said this morning for what so far has been a great symposium. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker in this afternoon, Ulaş, who is one of our own terrible, naughty boys. No, very good student. He's doing his MA with Philip, who isn't here, on Pope Innocent III and crusade policy. His talk today, however, is reflections on the evolution of kingship in 13th century Norway, with special reference to Konungs Skuggsjau, or the King's Mirror from medieval Norway. Okay, good luck.
Good afternoon, everyone. I also want to thank the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for being here today. First of all, before I begin, I should confess that this paper had a past life. David knows. It originally began as a final paper for the David's Vikings class, but the reason I decided to revisit it is that since that semester with David and the Vikings, I have spent much more time working on papacy and ecclesiastical rhetoric, writings, papal bulls, those kind of boring stuff. And once I returned to the King's Mirror with that background, I realized I was no longer reading it as I had before. So no, David Hocam, I'm not presenting the same paper I gave to you that I barely got an A for, A minus.
No one ever gets an A.
It's quite a lot has changed since then. What I want you to offer today is substantially the rethought version of that earlier work, one that asks what happens when we read the King's Mirror, not just as a Norwegian version of the Mirror for Princes text, there's a general genre, but through the political and rhetorical habits of the papal-influenced 13th century. My research is about the King's Mirror, in Latin Speculum Regale, or in the original language, Konungs Skuggsjau. One of the most important literary political texts we possess from the 13th century Norway, and it is basically structured as a dialogue between a father and the son. The little boy asks questions about how to live, how to behave in the earlier parts. The text mostly speaks about merchants, ethics, world around Norway, and practical life, but in its later parts, it turns towards politics, towards how kingsmen should act and behave, and then towards the kings himself. So this is not just a book about morality in some vague sense. It is intended to, it's written for the king's son, so it's also a book about how to rule, and more importantly, it is a book about how rule should be understood. The text is generally dated to the mid-13th century. Its author remains unknown. That uncertainty matters to me, but not because I want to solve the authorship question today. Hell no, I'm not going to do that. What matters for me is that this is an anonymous but highly educated, especially biblically literate text produced in a period when the Norwegian kingship was already becoming more organized, more ceremonial, more deeply tied to the Christian political language. And it is precisely the kind of text we should read it as an argument. I do not read the King's Mirror simply as a proof that the ideas of kingship in Norway had already changed, which is the most of the historiography does. I read it as a deliberate intervention designed to change it further. In other words, this text is not just observing a political transformation, it is trying to complete a one. It is trying to move the Norwegian kingship away from the older customary and the more personal modes of political authority and towards a more sacred, hierarchical, office-based model of monarchy. And it does so in a language that, to my mind, looks strikingly close to the language and tactics of the clerical and papal political writing. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not making an authorship claim. I'm not saying this text is written by Pope himself or any other papal official. We cannot know that. We cannot trace it to one direct Roman source. That will be a different paper and much harder one, but I guess much fun one, maybe in the future. My exact point is the King's Mirror argues like a clerical text, argues like a political text, and it speaks in the language of the sacred office, divine designation, elevated judgment, and sanctified obedience. And that matters because once we notice that language, the text begins to look less like a mirror and more like an instrument. Let me start with the loyalty part, because this is where the text begins to reveal its methods more clearly. One of the examples the father tells about his son is the story of Joseph. In the biblical accounts, most of you probably know, Joseph refuses the Potiphar's wife by saying, "My master trusts me with everything in his house. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" But in the retelling in the King's Mirror version, the wording is slightly altered. In there, Joseph says, "But even worse is the unfaithfulness towards my Lord, which I should be guilty of, if I were to reward his kindness in this way like a treacherous thrall." It's a bit heavier, okay, but I'm not simply talking about the translation variation. There is a different point in this retelling version. The shift from the sin against God to unfaithfulness towards my Lord is small in wording, but not small in meaning. The text is relocating the moral center of the story. It's directing the biblical language into the political instruction, because Lord is not repeatedly used, as we all know, it's used interchangeably with God, not in the King's Mirror. King's Mirror specifically uses God in the same story, but this time it uses the word Lord and doesn't say as master. So it merges the two of them. And that redirection is specifically mentioned in a part that tells about how the kingsman should act. So also the positioning of this Joseph's story, this biblical text, is also important. So Joseph is not simply a moral example. He's being used to teach a particular kind of loyalty. What was once a relationship of service, in the text, something much more elevated. Personal loyalty is not just longer reciprocal. It's not particular or customary. It is turned into a sacred obligation to Joseph. And this matters especially if you place it against the older Norwegian political culture, in that in the older world, loyalty was deeply personal, strong men gathered followings, authority was enacted through prestige, success, kinship, and negotiated ties. That world did not disappear overnight. Even in the 13th century, those habits were not simply gone, but the King's Mirror is trying to discipline them. It is trying to tell its audience that the loyalty to the king is no longer merely the loyalty one offers to a successful leader. It is something nearer to the obedience within a sacred order. This becomes even clearer in the text's repeated language for the king itself. The king is described as Lord's anointed. It's a general term, but not in the Norwegian sense. This is the first time we see, not specifically the first time, but this is the first time we see completely Lord's anointed word usage. The king is described as Lord's anointed. He is placed so high in the book, we are told that all bow down before him as before God. This is not merely just respect. This is not ordinary political deference. This language of elevation that pushes kingship into sacred register. What becomes striking is not only the idea itself, which is not new for the medieval Europe, but fairly new for the medieval Norway and its grammar. The king is not just powerful, he's figured as someone whose office participates in God's own order. That, to me, is where the papal parallel becomes useful, not because kings and popes are the same, but because this way of talking about office, dignity, and authority belongs much more to the clerical political discourse than to the older Norwegian customary kingship. In other words, the text is not just Christian, it's politically theological. And this leads us to the question of successions. the little boy's question about succession got answered really important, because the monarchy itself was not new to the Norway. Norway had already an established hereditary tradition. At the same time, older customs had not vanished too. Elections still mattered, the thing still mattered, the public assembly where in Norway political decisions could be recognized and kings formally accepted. So the older Norwegian political world was not a blank slate waiting for the kingship to arrive. Kingship was already there, but it existed within a much more complex and negotiated framework. What the King's Mirror does is not to invent monarchy, it recenters it. It insists that whatever visible mechanism, hereditary or election, God is the real chooser. And that is the very important move, because once the divine choice becomes the decisive explanatory principle, older forms do not necessarily disappear. They're still there, but they are subordinated to them. They remain present, but no longer as the ultimate sources of legitimacy. The visible procedures of Norwegian kingship survive. Underlying logic is just being replaced. And here again, I think the papal parallel is very useful, because what we are seeing is not just a stronger king, we're seeing a more abstract and more office-centered idea of authority. The text is not just interested in the king merely as a successful man, it is interested in a kingship as a sanctioned position and in divinely ordered hierarchy. That is a very different political world to the Norwegian one. Now, the third point I wanted to make, and for me this is one of the interesting parts of the book, the king's judicial role in Norway was historically much more limited than the image presented in the King's Mirror. The King's Mirror, the kings in the Norway were not ordinarily acting as a courtroom judges like in the same way in the Denmark or Sweden. Of course, the kings had legal importance, they could review law, they could pardon, intervene, but the strong image of the king as the final judicial center is much more pronounced in the text rather than the actual practice in Norwegian kings. So once again, the source is not merely reflecting political reality, it is enlarging it. And the way it enlarges, it's extremely revealing. As Sverbak, a historian in this topic, has argued, one of the author's main points is that the kings should imitate God. That is the key. The king's justice is not just practical governance, it is modeled on divine justice. Now you'll understand why you're looking at Adam and Eve picture for a long time. This becomes very clear in the Adam and Eve section in the book. The father tells the story of Adam and Eve, and here I want to slow down for a moment because the comparison is really important here. Because in the biblical version, in the Genesis chapter 3, the structure is fairly direct. God gives Adam a command, Adam and Eve break it. God confronts them, questions them, hears their answer, and punishes them. It's fairly simple, it's God. It doesn't need anything to give the punishment. It is dramatic, but it's not really a procedural in a legal sense. There are no formal witnesses, no safe conduct, no temporary protection while the case is being prepared, no explicit legal space. It's Bible. Now compare that to the King's Mirror version. In its retelling, and I want to underline this. I read there are three versions of the translated text. All of them is like this, so I'm not imagining this. In the retelling, in the King's Mirror, we are told that 4 sisters were called to witness this covenant. Divine virgins who should hear the laws decreed and learn all the terms of the agreement. Then, after the breach of the covenant, Peace, one of the virgins, says to Adam and Eve, I will keep you safe in a secret hiding place until judgment is pronounced your case. And I give you the safety that you may have opportunity to present your defense. So this is a remarkable change because it's completely altered. The story is much more like a modern legal drama now because biblical narrative has been reshaped into something juridical. There are witnesses appearing, procedures appears, God needs time to procedure, and Adam and Eve has a time to prepare their defense. Temporary protection also appears, and that temporary protection is especially interesting in the Norwegian context because it resembles the grith. It is a form of truce or a legal protection granted for a limited time so that a person could remain under peace and not be attacked or punished before the matter was settled. So, when peace offers Adam and Eve a protection until judgment, this is not just colorful storytelling. It sounds very close to a recognizably legal and political idea. In other words, the author is not merely quoting the scripture, he's reorganizing it so that the divine justice can be imagined through the legal framework that is intelligible to a Norwegian audience. So, if I have to put the whole argument together, this is what I would say. The King's Mirror is a text of political education. It's not just describing the Norway, it is educating the Norway. It is trying to teach its audience how to imagine a kingship. And in doing so, it works against an older Norwegian political culture that is rooted in personal bonds, customary forms, negotiated legitimacy, and a much less abstract understanding of authority. It offers instead a king who is anointed, judicial, morally elevated, and conceptually aligned with the divine order. That is why I think the papal comparison is useful, not because the text is secretly papal or origin. I'm not assuming a secret plan of Pope. Because it shares with the clerical and the papal political writing in a distinctive way of imagining power, office over the person, sacred hierarchy over the negotiated custom, and obedience as a moral and religious duty rather than simply a social one. So in conclusion, I would suggest that the King's Mirror title is a bit misleading if we have to take the word mirror too literally. The text does not merely reflect the political transformation, it participates in one. It takes the older Norwegian world and speaks to it in a newer language. It borrows from biblical authority, reshapes the scriptural narrative, and absorbs local legal logic. And if it's really a mirror, it's not a clear and ordinary mirror, it's more closer to like the distorted ones, the fun mirrors, like that. It does reflect the king, but it just does it in a way that the king is reflected on the mirror is much more augmented, it's way taller, way bigger, heavier and imposing. And above all, it's more divine than otherwise might appear. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Bilkent University History at Department of History and the Symposium Committee for organizing this valuable symposium. This is also my first presentation in English, so I would like to apologize in advance for any mistakes. This paper grew out of a study I prepared for my PhD course named Modern European Institutional History and Turkey, and I tried to connect subsidiarity with the Middle Ages. So my main question is this: can we see subsidiarity-like practices in the Reichskirchensystem? But I should also be clear that I'm not claiming that the modern subsidiarity already exists in the Middle Ages. I'm also aware that the risks of bringing a term which generally used in the public administration field into history. But my aim is here more modest. I only suggest that some similar patterns of shared authority can be seen in the medieval empire. So here's the agenda. I will begin with the definition and the historical background of subsidiarity to the audience who's not familiar with the term. Then I will focus the Reichskirchensystem, and then I will focus on the subsidiarity-like practices in the Reichskirchensystem, and I will conclude the presentation. So what is subsidiarity? Subsidiarity means that decisions and responsibilities should remain at the lowest level possible. Higher authority should intervene only when lower levels cannot solve the problem sufficiently. Today, this is mainly known as the modern principle of the European Union. It's a division of the competences between the European Union and its member states. The word comes from Latin subsidium, which means help, support, or reserve assistance. So the basic idea is simple. Higher authority should support lower levels, not replace them. The historical roots of subsidiarity often traced back to Aristotle. He offered a layered view of society, like the household, and the village, and the polis. Thomas Aquinas adapted this idea to the medieval world and described society as a unity of order in which smaller communities keep their own role within a larger whole. I find this important because he helps us see how a layered social order could be understood in the Middle Ages, not simply as hierarchy, but also as a structure in which different communities had their own roles and a certain degree of legitimate autonomy. Later, this line continues with the early modern German jurist and Calvinist Johannes Althusius, who first they used the word subsidia in his work Politica, and was given a clear model form in Catholic social teaching with encyclicals Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno. What was the Reichskirchensystem? It refers to the close cooperation between rulers and church institutions in the Ottonian and Saline periods, from the middle of the 10th century to 12th century, in East Frankish and later Holy Roman realm. Bishops and abbots became important political partners here, and this helped rulers strengthen their position against powerful secular nobles. Secular nobles could build hereditary dynasties and pass power to their sons, but bishops and abbots, at least in principle, could not do this in the same way. Here I have to here one short historical note necessary. Some historians like Timothy Reuter have questioned how coherent or systematic this structure really was, but I do not enter that debate in detail in this presentation. I only use the term here as a useful historical model. The system began to take clearer shape under Otto I, the first emperor of the Ottonian dynasty. After a series of revolts, which occurred 953 to 955, and includes Otto's own family members like his son Luidolf, his brother Henry, and his son-in-law Conrad. Otto relied more on bishops and abbots. They seemed more useful than hereditary nobles because they could support royal rule without building family dynasties in the same way. Henry II, the last emperor of the Ottonian era, strengthened the policy further and tied bishoprics more closely to the royal government. So at first, the Reichskirchensystem, or imperial church system, was clearly a tool of centralization, not local autonomy. But decentralization is beneficial for centralization as long as rulers and church are in harmony. And this system did not remain stable forever. Its limits became much clearer during the investiture controversy. The investiture controversy was a major conflict over the appointment of bishops and abbots. It showed the limits of royal control and ended with the Concordat of Worms in 1122. After that, church institutions gained more room to act, and this became an important step toward a more layered political order. Although the system began as a centralizing policy, it also gave church institutions lands, rights, and immunities. And over time, some bishops and abbots gained wider powers, including judicial authority. In a sense, the ruler delegates his central authority to church officials for implementation at the local level. In this way, monasteries and bishoprics were not just passive tools of the ruler. They could act more independently in local affairs. And later, the investiture controversy further limited the direct royal control over appointments and helped increase ecclesiastical autonomy. After the Concordat of Worms, it becomes difficult to speak of the Reichskirchensystem in its earlier, stronger form. But many of the church's territorial, judicial, and institutional gains remained, but the ruler's direct control over appointments was clearly reduced. So the same system that had been created to strengthen the center also created more room for lower institutions to act. I'm not fully convinced that I also convinced myself when I also prepared this paper, but I found this important. Its strength, this argument's strength, is that it shows how a centralizing system could also create a layered structure of authority and some local autonomy. But of course, as I mentioned in the beginning, its limits that subsidiarity is a modern concept, so the comparison cannot be exact. For this reason, the argument is about similarity, not identity. To conclude, the Reichskirchensystem was first created to strengthen central authority, but over time, it also created room for limited ecclesiastical autonomy. Again, this does not mean that medieval Europe already had subsidiarity in the modern sense. However, it does suggest subsidiarity-like practices and early logic of shared authority within the medieval empire. And this illumination symbolizes me after the critics I probably get. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, that was a very interesting talk and various questions I may ask if I have a chance. Otherwise, obviously, I will defer to all of you later. Okay, we're doing well for time. Mehmet was shorter than the 15 minutes, so that brings us more or less back to schedule. Okay, our third and final speaker in this session is another one of the Bilkent bad boys, Doğuş Aytaç, who has the misfortune of doing his research with me. Doğuş, like Ulaş, I should have mentioned before, Doğuş is a graduate of the Bachelor's History program in METU, but he came over and did his MA over here with us, graduating in 2020 during COVID, difficult times and so on. He did his MA on the so-called monastic reaction in 10th century Anglo-Saxon England. He's staying in the same kind of area today, and he's going to be looking at tracing local customs in early English law. And you want to come and do the thing. Sorry, yeah, okay, yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start with thanking by not anyone in particular, but rather my morning coffee that gets me going throughout this day so far. Just barely holding on to 3 hours of sleep. So I will be mainly talking about this, what I kind of like to call local customs or local traditions in the early English law. So when we are looking at the overall the history of the English law, it can be traced all the way back to the 7th century, basically, when we see the appearance of the first known written law in Anglo-Saxon England. And with the appearance of this first known law to us, Anglo-Saxons, unfortunately for the legal historians, produced too many laws, perhaps, until 1066 with the coming of the Normans. Some would be in the form of codified laws, these law codes that would usually be attributed to one king or another, or they would be writing some legal tracts that would be usually dealing with some specific aspect of the law, rather than dealing with the law as a whole. And the tradition of early English law itself appears to be a rather strong one, because with the coming of the Normans, with the changes in the administration and all that, the law itself, the Anglo-Saxon laws, this early English law, doesn't really disappear at all. It persists, and the Norman rulers later adapt these rules, laws, and later they decided to study these laws as well. Sometimes they translated them, they make their own large legal compilations, such as Quadripartitus is one example, and some of these compilations even became our only source for certain English legal texts. And the laws themselves, at least for certain parts of the historiography, seen as this part of a singular tradition, as in, this English tradition, this English law tradition, rather than a collection of traditions that may have been in place. And prior to the appearance of an English kingdom in around 950, in the middle of the 10th century, Britain, however, consists of many kingdoms. And many of them perhaps disappeared rather quickly, as some of them grew stronger over time and absorbed the others. And sometimes, Scandinavians decided to come in and destroy these kingdoms as well. But still, some of these kingdoms, at the very least, persisted for over 200 years. So it would really be unwise to assume that these kingdoms had not developed their own traditions of their own since their foundations. And here, with this paper, with this presentation, I try to trace some of these local customs, local traditions that these earlier kingdoms may had at the time. And to really start us off, I like to point to a problem within the Anglo-Saxon legal corpus. We have in our hands a really good number of legal texts surviving from the pre-conquest period. As I said, we have these law codes promulgated by kings, various types of legal tracts, and many lawsuits that deal with the law in action. However, the surviving law codes are posing a really problem for us. The first set of laws that we have, the earliest English laws, come from Kingdom of Kent, such as this manuscript here. This is the first known English law code of King Ethelbert of Kent, preserved in the Textus Rofensis. And the rest of the law codes we have, however, are almost all of them promulgated by kings of Wessex, and then from 10th century onwards by kings of England, as we should be calling them. However, when we are looking at the earliest history of Anglo-Saxons here, Anglo-Saxon England consisted of several kingdoms. Yet again, the surviving locals only coming from two of them, the Wessex and Kent. But here we are seeing all these other kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex. None of these kingdoms apparently didn't feel the need to produce their own law codes. And when it comes to tracing local customs and traditions within the early English law, this creates a huge problem for us. I mean, we can't really say that these kingdoms had no written culture whatsoever, nor these kingdoms were insignificant in any way. Yet we don't have any kind of direct evidence from these kingdoms. And while it's true that the majority of them were short-lived, either by being absorbed by other kingdoms or by the destruction caused by Scandinavians, it is still striking that we don't have any evidence of written laws surviving from them. We have, however, some passing references to other regions in the laws decreed by kings of Wessex, and also in some of the other legal tracts as well. So one such example here is from a quite well-known law code from Anglo-Saxon England, which is the law code of King Alfred, or more commonly referred to as Alfred's Dombok, which really means a book of dooms or book of judgment. And here, Alfred, in the prologue of his law code, decides to make reference to several other individuals. So he says, those that I found either from the time of Ine, my kinsman, or of Offa, king of the Mercians, or of Ethelbert, who first in England received baptism, those which seemed most just to me, I gathered herein and left out the others. So he's basically telling us that, okay, I collected all these laws and put them together. In a was also another king of Wessex in the late 7th century, if I remember correctly. So it is natural that he is kind of adapting laws of Ine and preserving them in his own law code. And the only surviving text of laws of Ine also is basically attached at the end of Alfred's own laws. Ethelbert, perhaps they had knowledge of his first laws in some capacity here. Offa, however, is kind of more interesting inclusion here. And Offa was a king of Mercia in the 8th century, one of the most well-known kings from this period, who had basically dominated the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during his reign. He also had established his own connections with the continent. He had these connections with the Francia too. Even some of the monasteries, and I know of at least one of them, forged their own charters, of giving them some land. So he is quite the well-known figure. He had this kind of overlordship over all these kingdoms during his time, but he doesn't have a surviving law code. The only reference to a possibility of a law code from Offa comes from Alfred's, reference to him. So it is kind of an unusual inclusion here as well. And we unfortunately don't have any kind of extant documents from his period, from Offa's period. We only have King Alfred's words for it. And this is basically the singular reference to a possible Mercian royal law code. It could be a kind of a resonance of the political ideology as well, because by the time of Alfred, we are seeing the expansion of Wessex a little bit as well. He married his own daughter into Mercian royal family, kind of securing the future of Mercia to be absorbed into Wessex, eventually by his son Edward the Elder. So perhaps the inclusion of Offa was in a way to legitimize the laws and how they could further be implemented in other areas of England as well. And we should obviously, keep in mind that lack of any royal laws code surviving from Mercia does not necessarily mean that there were no laws in place whatsoever. It might simply that, whatever legal text they had produced might be lost over time, or that they may have relied more heavily on oral law rather than the written law. And apart from this reference to Offa's possible lost law code, there are some other references to Mercian law that we can find in legal tracts produced in later periods, and also some others as well. So one particular example that I would like to point to is this Beleude Gedingtum and Lage, on the ranks of people and law. This compilation of social status was written by Archbishop Wulfstan. It is essentially a text about people of different social status, how they would be move on about the social ranks, how they would be gaining certain rights based on their social standing. And the second part of this document is of interest to us, called Bevergilde, on Vergild. Now, Vergild basically means man price. It is some kind of a compensation that would be paid for certain crimes. Here, particularly, if you murder someone, you will be paying the Vergild of the individual you killed. His man price. Everyone has a basically a price here based on their social standing. And I won't be dwelling into the origins of Vergilds. It is interesting on its own, regardless. So another important point, however, that we have with this document with the Vergild, in one manuscript, it is titled as Nordleodalaga, the law of the northern people. So Archbishop Wulfstan when he was, compiling at least one version of his compilation on the social status, he decided to omit completely this alternative title, or perhaps the original title, Nordleodolaga. And the law of the northern people is basically a law of Northumbrians. So this is another kind of a reference to another kingdom and its laws coming from a much later period, in fact. And these two texts have some interesting things to tell us. So in Bevergil'de, Archbishop Wulfstan is telling us, according to the folklore of the English people, but in the Nordleodolaga, it says, the North people's king. And the rest of the text is basically the same. So we have this reference to a North people's king and their laws, but when it comes to adapting this text into, perhaps in order to apply it to the whole of the kingdom, the North people part is completely omitted. Yet again, we should say, this is kind of like how things were going on in the Northern Kingdom, in Northumbria. And here, the Trimsa part, if anyone's interested, it is just a term used for gold coin here. And the text basically continues with the lower classes after this. What is interesting here comes from both of these texts is the sixth clause that says a commoner's vergild is 266 trimsas, that is 200 shillings according to the law of Mercians. So this is perhaps originally was a Northumbrian law, but here a commoner's vergild is based on the law of the Mercians, not law of Northumbrians. And even in the Bevergild, Archbishop Wulfstan, when he talks about King of England, when it comes to King's vergild, he doesn't really omit that the commoner's vergild is based on law of Mercians. So we have these interesting little bits to find in these, documents. And moving on, once the vergild part ends, once the vergild part ends, we are presented with the Bemiknalaga on the law of Mercians. So here, this didn't change at all by Archbishop Wulfstan at all. He simply, lists us the, how based on the Mercian law, apparently, the vergild was put in place. Okay, we are going to be speedrunning some of these parts, unfortunately. Quickly moving on onto some other legal texts quite quickly, particularly we are talking about a little bit on the King Athelstan's law codes. He has 6 law codes attributed to him, but most important for our purposes is the third code, which makes reference to assembly and faversham. So here we are seeing that particularly with the Athelstan's codes, not all of them were simply royal law codes, but some of them were non-royal law codes. What that means is that we are seeing that in localities, by local assemblies, the law codes would be interpreted, they would be heard by the local assemblies, and they would also implement some changes into the existing law codes promulgated by King himself. So overall, what we are seeing here is, and unfortunately I am really speeding up a lot of things here, we are also seeing the importance of the localities, and the regions and their needs, and how they could also shape the laws promulgated by kings based on their own needs, and how they decide to interpret these laws and also implement them in their localities. So this is only one example that we have from two of Athelstan's law codes. The third one being, again, the result of a local one, which implemented some changes to the original kind of ordinance here. They talk about the person's social status here. And also in another law code here, which is the sixth code of Athelstan, sometimes also referred to as London Ordinance of London Peace Guild. They also talk about, how the process was going. They sent some kind of representatives of their own, shire perhaps, to the King's Own Assembly, who would be pledging to the ordinances, and then they would bring these ordinances back to their own shires, and then the people there would be exacting some kind of pledge there as well. So overall, sorry for kind of taking it too long here, we are seeing some passing references to local customs being in place in the early English law, with the references to Mercian law, with the texts being titled as, Nordleodalaga or Myknalaga. There were some local customs being in place and also being acknowledged as well. And there are quite a lot of references there that I had to omit when I worked on this paper. And unfortunately, we don't have any kind of other royal law codes coming from the other kingdoms, but again, that doesn't mean that, there weren't any. Perhaps they were simply deemed unnecessary by certain people to preserve. And thank you for listening.